Limited time troops. Sometimes they're incredibly broken and other times absolutely buns, dude. Today we're looking at those event troops that just weren't that good. They didn't all suck, just that some of them were very niche or had better replacements, you know? This list won't be in any particular order, by the way, I just kind of threw them together.
Let's do this.
Ice Wizard. This one is interesting because it was the first temporary troop in the game. So obviously it was very popular, even though it sucked. Yeah, the Ice Wizard had some pretty annoying quirks. So obviously this was just a wizard that instead of shooting fireballs, it threw ice and it would slow defenses. At the time, this was very unique because there was nothing else in the game that had such an ability to slow anything down. I mean, the closest thing we had was the freeze spell, and that was not slowing, it was a freeze spell. So it was cool, but the problem with it though is that it wasn't good at doing what it was supposed to do. Usually you put these like ranged troops in back of a tank, right? So they don't die in 5 seconds. But because the Ice Wizards were fast and targeted defenses, they'd often walk alongside the tanks, not behind them, and sometimes even got in front of them and immediately got obliterated. So it was great in theory, but in real attacks, they'd often go kamikaze style, you know? It was safer to use something else. The Ice Wizard would come back many times through the years, but every time it did, it became less and less useful because there were now other ways you could slow defenses accurately, so it felt very dated. Like a troop that was just better where it came from. Clash Royale. Luckily for those who do enjoy this troop, they have improved dramatically over the years. It's gotten some massive buffs and some helpful changes, but because of its defense targeting mechanics and short range, there's still better options to recommend for ranged attackers. Pumpkin Barbarian. This troop was released in October 2017. It was actually one of the 2 first Clashoween troops. The other was the giant skeleton. So it was exactly what it looks like. It was a barbarian with a pumpkin on its head, and this pumpkin was supposed to be a shield. Whenever the barbarian got hit, the pumpkin would take that initial damage. It was pretty much like the guards from Clash Royale, but their shield wasn't as useful because a bomb could take all of them out, regardless if the pumpkin was on them or not. But that was it. There was literally nothing else to it. It was just a barbarian with an extra shield. It was cool anyway. You know, for 2017, it was interesting to get to play around with it. But the novelty wore off pretty quick, especially how high-level players didn't even use barbarians anymore, so why use these? The good thing about them though was that it was the same housing space, so if you were already using barbarians, this was the obvious choice. But it clearly wasn't a fan favorite, and it never came back as a troop that you could freely use, but it was available in a special challenge in 2021. It's possible that it makes a return sometime, but it was certainly one of the least memorable, and if it does, they need to buff the crap out of it. Debt Collector. First available in 2025 during the Dark Deal event, the Debt Collector was a goblin that targeted resource buildings and loot way more than a regular goblin. It didn't steal more, it just came up with it. I don't know, goblin shenanigans. So for example, every 1 gold you stole, the Debt Collector would give you 2. So in theory, looting should have yielded double the loot. It should have been one heck of a farming troop, but it wasn't, mostly because of its stats. It was 4 times the housing space as a regular goblin, but not quite 4 times the survivability. Not even close, it would die just as easily. And it was slow, half the speed as an ordinary goblin. So by the time it got to the resource buildings, it was dead. More like Debt Collector, because you know, it was never alive. So even though it could give you double the loot, its stats were terrible. So you had to send in a bunch of these, like a whole army of them, just to attack a dead base. At that point, players were like, with the time I'm wasting with these, I could just train sneaky goblins and do it way faster. Of course, there was a trade-off. You didn't have the multiplier, but the usefulness and ability on the sneaky goblins was objectively better. The Debt Collector has not returned yet. It's the most recent on the list, so it makes sense. But whenever it does, I'm almost positive they'll give it some buffs because it was buns. Barcher. First available in 2023 for the Match of Madness event, the Barcher, as the name implies, is a mashup of a barbarian and archer. More specifically, the raged barbarian and sneaky archer because it had their abilities. For the first 5 seconds, it was raged and invisible. So I gotta give it to the Barcher. It gets some cool points for being a decent utility troop. People didn't carry a whole army of them, just like a couple to help them funnel. It was pretty similar to a sneaky goblin, but it targeted any any building. However, it ended up on this list because it wasn't really good at anything else. I mean, at lower town halls, it was a great troop for farming, but as soon as you unlock sneaky goblins, adios. And the higher town hall you were, the less likely you were gonna find them useful. So it just didn't have much uses for the average player. It's the same exact reason why the first troops unlocked in the game don't get used later in game. They're not bad troops, there's just far better options. It was fun to use, don't get me wrong, but most players used it for a couple attacks and forgot about it. It did return for 2024 and 2025, and it will probably keep returning, but it seriously needs another buff for the upper levels. Battle Ram. First available in 2017 during the 5th anniversary of the game, the Battle Ram was one of those situations where they added a class-real card into the game. It was basically the same troop from there, Barbarians carrying this ram, and it would eventually hit something and Barbarians continued on. But it was quite literally the same troop, and that wasn't good because, you know, in Clash Royale it targets buildings, right? So that's what it did in Clash of Clans. Any building, and it was bad. Now on paper, it didn't seem terrible. For 5 housing space, you got 4 barbarians, and the other housing space was for the ram probably, right? And that did an okay amount of damage when it hit something. It sounds all right, except because it targeted anything, it would often go for the trash buildings outside. And when it did deploy the barbarians, they weren't even normal barbarians. They were roughly the equivalent of level 1 barbarians, no matter what town hall you were at. I'm not really sure why they thought that was a great idea, but it was cheeks. The barbarians died almost immediately. They did rework it in the middle of the event at some point. They changed it to target walls and they took 1 less housing space. But it still was not worth using them because you needed 2 or 3 of them to break open a wall, and at that point, just use wall breakers, man. I think people really wanted them to target defenses instead. That would have been killer, but they didn't do that. There were jokes that the only reason people were using them was to get the 250 gems from the event, and that was it. I don't blame them. I gotta give it to them though. When it came back in 2025, it was way more robust in that it had a way higher wall multiplier, so it was comparable to a super wall breaker. Snake Barrel. This was an air troop available during the 2025 Snake Festival event. It was a barrel full of snakes. Who would have guessed that? When deployed, it flew in like that one skeleton barrel troop, which is another temporary troop. It's also in the clan capital. And when the balloons popped, it dropped the barrel, dealing a tiny amount of damage and deployed a bunch of snakes. Now, I do want to say it wasn't bad at every town hall. Lower town hall level players had a lot of success spamming these and seeing great results. It's a pretty common theme with these troops in this video. They were pretty alright at the lower town halls. In some cases, even OP. Now, they could be used at higher town halls if you were decent at the game, but just because you could didn't mean you should. You were better off using balloons or literally any other air troop. See, the snakes had okay stats by themselves, but they tended to group up and stay together the entire time, so any splash damage would annihilate them in seconds. Even if you tried to use them in armies where there were tanks, most town halls have a lot of random splash damage coming from all directions and dealing tons of AoE at random points. The snakes were very hard to protect. Sometimes I wonder if the fact that the housing space, damage, and hit points at max level being all number 8s was limiting its potential a bit, but at least it was a cool Easter egg that nobody even noticed, right? 8, by the way, being a lucky number in China, which was what the event was based around, the Lunar New Year thing. Anyway, there have been worse troops, but it could have been better. Azure Dragon. First available during the Dragon Festival event, the Azure Dragon was one of 2 temporary troops, the other being the Firecracker, which was basically a walking scattershot. The Azure Dragon, on the other hand, didn't really have anything unique about it. In fact, that's why it ended up on this list. It was basically a super dragon wearing a costume. It had very identical stats. The only key difference was its splash radius. Instead of damaging nearby buildings like the super dragon, it hit the ones behind what it was targeting. So it wasn't always as effective as a super dragon, and trying to funnel them into bases was kind of awkward as well because of how its splash worked. The comparison with the Super Dragon was inevitable. They were very identical. People were calling it a worse Super Dragon because they were slower, they had less HP, and their splash damage area was small. It was actually supposed to have a lot more HP, but it was nerfed before it even came out, so perhaps that's one of the reasons it was such an underwhelming event troop. It wasn't all terrible though. The lower town halls, as usual, had a lot of success with it, and for its return in 2026, they were buffed, so they were pretty decent then. But yeah, that is every event troop that sucked. Honestly, I don't want to call it that. Some of them were pretty good, especially at lower town halls as we discussed, but just that some of them have mechanics that don't work out in Clash of Clans or are in dire need of a buff. And some of them already have gotten buffs, so some of these are pretty decent these days. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed today's video, but before you go, YouTube thinks you'll like this next video, so why don't you check it out? As always, have a gaming out. Peace.